Here is the breach. With each cycle, more seeps into her. Kill her. Now.
What? Then how'd I be any different?
Perhaps Entrati had a much better argument here to offer us. One Kang from the Marvel show Loki puts quite perfectly, if you ask me. Tell me what you think.
What? Then how'd I be any different?
Grow up, murderer, hypocrite. We're all villains here. We all done horrible, terrible, horrific things.
And we all have. Hey all, Siege here, and today we embark on perhaps the most controversial episode to air on the channel, all based upon information yet again found within the KIM system. I've made mention in the past regarding how insightful and interesting the inclusion of a former Orokin's perspective is to have, and incredibly enough, one thought in particular Roathe postulates to us within his dialogue entries is something I've personally attempted to explain to others in the past countless times, but far too many just refuse to allow the possibility for. Unfortunately, however, in an observational capacity at least, I still have yet to hear an argument that contradicts the concept. Specifically, the idea he presents regarding good and evil. He says, if an individual were to commit evil deeds in a vacuum, as a single person without any others around to judge them, there would be no one to judge them evil, would there? If a bastard burns down a forest and no one is around to hear him, does it make a sound? The only measure we have to judge good and evil deeds are the deeds of others. All the most horrifying acts a person can commit require at least a second person to commit them. It is merely a measuring stick used by society to judge your actions against those of others. To which our operator so deliciously replies, say you're right. Say you've convinced me that good and evil are just social constructs. What then? What then indeed? He goes on to say, if we were to show great evil living peacefully, happily, wonderfully in love, what kind of lesson would that teach? What would it mean if a person who is capable of evil deeds were still to be loved by another? What would that do to society? When I told you the story of Ballas and Margulis, it was hard to accept that their love for each other was once real, wasn't it? It goes without question that Ballas was capable of some of the purest forms of cruelty humanity has ever known. And yet, he knew love, mutual love. This is a fact. Though you may wish to deny it now, Ballas and Margulis loved each other deeply. It simply went terribly wrong. But we must scrub that story clean of their love. We must say it did not exist. We must say it was not real, that it was a fallacy. Why? With our drifter answering, because evil has to look into the mirror and work to change itself. It has to be punished, and to love and be loved is the ultimate reward. And Roathe emphatically agrees, saying, very good. Exactly that. We must hold great evil to task. If we allow it to feel love and be loved, I think all the world might crumble around us. And where would we be then? Now, there is a very obvious self-serving nature to what Roathe tells us here, but it doesn't make what he says wrong. This is, for most, a very difficult pill to swallow, but in my experience, as well as pretty much everything that's been recorded in written history, insinuates that unfortunately, he's right. Sadly, right and wrong, or good and evil, are largely perspective-based. One group believes they are righteous, and thus the other must in fact be evil. But it's never ever that simple. The problem, of course, is nuance. The fine details of how a thing, be it a thought, a painting, a song, or similar concept, can have layers to its actual meaning, even if its surface level information doesn't appear to have such complexity. Let me ask you, how often in the history of forever do you fathom the quote-unquote evil group believe themselves to be monsters? to be the bad guys. Do you think it's ever happened? Something like what one might see from a comic book villain? Even those characters are not written with nuance in mind, making siding with the good guys a bit more difficult than it used to be. And within this specific part of Roathe's messages, one can clearly see he is attempting to make that very point. That from the perspective of those others have deemed monsters, specifically himself and the Orokin, well, they don't necessarily agree with that position. Now, in their case, I believe they've earned that moniker, but in the greater picture, which group wouldn't or hasn't already done the same? The Corpus? They already employ a very hierarchical structure at this point, with their own board of governors strongly resembling the Seven, perhaps even already operating a similar kind of shadowed two-tier society, as it's greatly insinuated from what we've seen. Does Granum's reemergence even have any meaning anymore within the current Corpus governance, given that Parvos seems to be branching off, making something better, at least from his perspective, due to what he believes the group he originally founded has now become? The Grineer are really no different, even being more militant in their structure and subsequent quests to occupy as much of the origin system their former masters have relinquished as they can. And within the deeper lore of the old piece, we really do learn that even the Sentients, created beings very much appearing as misunderstood and even innocent, are anything but. In reality, they meant to replace the Orokin in the exact same way all of these other groups have exhibited. And they were much better at it than any of the aforementioned factions.
For so long, the Orokin Empire had no enemies. Its military existed merely to pursue petty grudges, house against house, executor against executor. When the Sentients attacked, we knew a unity long denied to us. The Dax drew their swords against something other than an insolent peasant or a larcenous trader. The emperors, the deathless titular rulers of the Empire whose power was vested in the executors, lurched awake on their dusty golden thrones. War. Magnificent war. At last, the Empire meant something, defined by an extinction more imminent than the sun's eventual death. We drank deep of the nectar of life. We did not expect to lose. After the Sentients' first expeditionary strike, we had prepared a punitive counterblast. The Gilderglass Enchantress rose out of Serra's fog on lethal wings, a galleon laden heavy with drones and silver-armored myrmidons. Circuitry, fine as mist, formed a delicate lace beneath her translucent plating. So vast she was that she barely cleared the edges of the solar rail. The Sentients made sure we saw the outcome. They sang and our technology failed. Our warriors struggled and suffocated inside their shining suits. The crew of the Gilderglass Enchantress roasted alive as she swan-dived engineless through the skies of Tau, a complex and costly firework. Now, I remember the developments of martial Archimedia were, at first, presented as entertainments, like debauched roues watching criminals put to death in an arena circus. We fancied we were coming up with new and titillating ways to dispatch a far inferior foe. How we flattered ourselves. In truth, we innovated desperately, knowing ourselves outmatched by our Protean enemies. They tore through us like swarming children devouring their bloated mother. Desiccated, crushed between the pages of time, we had simply been out-evolved.
One could even say the Sentients were, philosophically speaking, born to do this very thing. Their sole purpose was to adapt, to survive under any circumstances, the only theoretical way for them to reach Tau, while at the same time building the solar rail that would safely carry whatever parts of Orokin society were chosen to go. This was until the Sentients evolved to the point of understanding the reason they were made in the first place, as no more than disposal parts for their maker's trip to and creation of a brand new world, enabling the Orokin nobility to completely bypass any kind of accountability for their overexploitation and experimentation on an entire solar system, as well as what would eventually become of this new land, and what would most likely happen to them once the sentients had outlived their usefulness. The same thing as everything else the Orokin didn't need anymore. It was at that point their evolution forced an understanding of what must be done in order to adapt to what was coming. To destroy the Orokin, something they were exceedingly good at.
We did not think of the sentients as a them so much as an it. We faced legions hurled at us with no more regard for their individual lives than corpuscles have. There were cells in the body of a sprawling, malevolent mass. We were, I think, too conditioned by our experiences with the infestation. A hive mind of quite a different order. The sentients had been given a mandate to evolve, and their only model of the endpoint of such evolution was us. They were returning to the origin system not just to obliterate the Orokin, but to replace them and ultimately perfect them.
While the Orokin relayed stories of victory home, the truth is the war really never went very well for them. From the onset of the fight, they were heavily mismatched, with their overconfident young lieutenants each meeting their ends in quick and brutal fashion.
I recall them now. Coteries of laughing Orokin youth. Nobility clad in the as yet unspoiled raiments of command. Childhood friends now in charge of legions of Dax, of Grineer, null matter cells, self-replicating carcinators, primitive biodrone blade spiders, canisters of low-tech troops, golden boys and girls with ravening devils at their beck. Their arrogance trickles like stinging sweat into my mind. They drank and sang, boasting of the times to come. They would make names for themselves, raise their families high in honor. So many of them fell. Not even their bodies were returned. To prevent the enemy from gleaning our secrets, they were Kuva-jolted to liquefy upon death. The hope of a generation turned to an oily puddle, sloshed through by Grineer boots. It was Skarn, testy, cerebral and acerbic, who had first mooted the plan back in the days before the war. We must fly the nest, for the nest is on fire. Through over-exploitation and reckless experiment, we had fouled the system beyond hope of regeneration. Expansion to new horizons was our only option now. He too inaugurated the cowardly towers in the void. The dread of a sentient return was so strong in him that he could only imagine retreat to islands within the void sea. How little credit we gave the sentients for courage. They willingly endured the void's scalding fire purely for the chance to punish us.
And Roathe confines in us the crux of his failure, that creating a strategy to attack an enemy whose main weapon is its ability to adapt is completely futile.
Monstrosity and excess had served us admirably in the past. I was expected to apply them as war tactics. How had we tamed the infestation in our ancestors' time? Rip open the atom's heart like a rosebud, of course. As one, the Seven bade me become a devil with a trident of warheads, a soul with a satchel of rampant radiation. That was the day we learned the sentients were not only capable of nullifying our technology, but also of commandeering it. The flock of wicked little leveler drones we sent out came winging merrily back to us, still heavy with bombs, chortling in unknown syllables, detonating in the midst of the very motherships that dispatched them. The losses were absurd. Many refused the data outright and deemed them errors, or lies, or cephalon conspiracies, raised and glutted on Orokin subterfuge. It was easy for them to reject the truth now. From that moment forth, they lived in a fantasy engineered for their comfort. We were winning. The Sentients were in retreat. All who thought otherwise were traitors. Many of the Sentients evolved between encounters, so we could never be sure that we would face the same foe twice. But others remained in consistent form, as if they had reached some plateau long ago. Perfected killers. They brought the same cold horror that a shark does. It was insanity. How could I strategize around the behavior of sentient crab ships when no sooner had my tactics been perfected than the crab ships were replaced by worm ships? And how long before those worm ships were themselves replaced by some new monstrosity? All we could do was go backward. Progress had been fatal. Old traditions, time-hallowed paths of honor and discipline were owed their due.
The Orokin would have themselves had to be able to function in a hive mind-like status to even have a chance to counter such a force. And even then, with the Sentients being able to modify their defenses on a whim, well, it makes this whole scenario close to an impossible feat. If not for the Warframes, as well as the operators, the Orokin most likely would have been wiped out much sooner, and the Sentients would be the current rulers of the Origin system, as well as Tau, and who knows how much more. So, are the Sentients good?
Trayvon, I watched you hurl your railjack into Pergassus Moor. Distracted, feeding greedily on you and your men, she never noticed my own ship speeding away. You laid down your life for your superior officer. I felt your selflessness like a slap in the face. Mariner, you gave me your body. Together in that trench, we drank Kuva. My hand shook and my gashed throat leaked, but I kept enough drops down for it to take. I remember your last salute, the fading. Then I blinked open the eyes that had been yours and saw my gutted corpse dead in the mud. Rustic. Something wrong in the cloning process, they said? What else could make a Grineer stay at his turret while burning alive? Even a rat understands self-preservation. No, your defect placed you above them.
From their perspective, certainly, but from any who would have challenged them taking over, we get a brief glimpse of what would have most likely been for any warriors attempting to oppose their reign during the beginning of the new war, where random Sentients are making sure their Grineer adversaries are fully dispatched, with Call 175 willing to give his life to stop their advances. Do you feel at that moment he could be convinced that the Sentients were the good guys here? In truth, what most characterize as good and evil is probably better described as what's good for the many over the few, with what most consider hero characters looking out for others before themselves, whereas evil seems to always have its own selfish interests in mind. Of course, this is predicated upon having others to look out for, because, as Roathe accurately points out, the absence of the many makes everything subjective. Much of what would be considered the greatest atrocities to have ever occurred have been by and large executed specifically for the safety and security of the quote-unquote greater good, according to the side perpetrating said aggression. But what of the other? Would they agree? I mentioned in the beginning of this video that this is a controversial subject because very few want to accept the nuance that accompanies almost every conflict. It's one of the reasons why the video has taken a bit longer to come out, because quite frankly, I was kind of worried about the response that would come from the video. But I think if the old war has taught us anything, it's that propaganda, deception, and misdirection are hallmarks of a successful regime.
I was effortlessly expert with many of our weapons, but I excelled in the use of one. The lie. I brandished it most often against my own troops. I whipped them to the bone with lies of duty and discipline. I smothered them with the lie that the war could be won. I pierced them with the lie of my favor. my most esteemed regard for them. Alone, in private, I turned that weapon on myself. Oh, how I bled!
In this case, requiring a literal artificial intelligence armed with adaptability as its primary superpower to finally be toppled. And while they all served, I'm guessing the large part willingly, do you really believe every person living within the Orokin society was inherently evil? Now, I'm sure they had their gripes with the Orokin government, but as long as they were allowed to pursue their own daily lives, clearly, far too many turned a blind eye to or flat out denied what parts they deemed impossible for their leaders to be guilty of, and went about their day. Otherwise, they would have themselves retaken the government, correct? After all, in theory, it would have been essentially the Seven against the rest of the collective origin system, would it not? Especially in how the executors seem to be the only ones with any actual authority and the autonomy to make any kind of significant decisions. Roathe even shows us how someone like himself was essentially no different from any other slave when it came down to those like Nitok, him wanting their demise as much as anyone.
I understood from the start, both on the battlefield and in the bedchamber, the path to victory through seeming submission. Where the enemy finds you yielding, there you can be sure he will push, and so you may easily trip him. Lackey, they called me. Lapdog. Nitok thought herself in control. How subtly I guided her. Roathe, the bloody-handed. Roathe, the ogre fattened on the bodies of his men. Spendthrift of lives. As if I battled only for the battle's sake. No. The Orokin Empire must end. For that to happen, the war must continue. Only defeat, absolute and irrevocable, would topple those 7 golden gargoyles. Not even Nitok knew my true heart. She thought I aspired to rule alongside her.
So why did it take the Sentients for it to happen? Well, as mentioned, probably first and foremost it begins with those that actually had some kind of power. Like our new Orokin friend, that knew of their exploits, but did nothing to oppose them. Saying they would, of course, but in action failing, just like the rest of the population. In fact, the memory Roathe so frantically protects, the reason for each of the Drifter's trips into the Descendia, is that while he wanted us to believe Entradi was the one who forced the Helminth serum upon him without any way of him refusing, keeping him from his glorious purpose, the truth is, he chose to take it and flee.
Coward. That is what they called me, isn't it? I've read the history books scattered about this dusty hall. A lie. They did not know the truth. That I was ripped away from my time before I could complete my work. Coward. I remember now. He approached me in the golden halls. He wore a face I did not know. But that is not so very unusual for our kind. I knew his voice. I knew the way he moved. Coward. He asked me a single question. Did I truly believe that I could ever be forgiven for burning it all to ash? Coward! In that pale, outstretched hand, a syringe, glittering with freedom, with another chance, with another life. I took it.
He chose to take it and flee.
Coward!
Willingly. A method by which to escape all of this. His association with the Orokin, his submissive relationship with Executor Nitok, and for the sake of this video, his involvement in the downfall of the Seven he claims to have been so desperate to see happen. It's the reason why, partway through the path to reclaiming his memories, he has a rather odd change of heart on the matter, wanting us to abandon any further uncovering of his memories. He began to feel at that point, even without knowing what it was yet, the moral weight of his choice back on Tau. That he had in fact not been the hero, the warrior he so vehemently claims, and instead, he chose the coward's path, the way out. Entradi offered, and he took it. In fact, it's in this, I believe, we can find the meaning behind the answer he gives to Albert in the Devil's Triad trailer.
Uriel, heretic of Zata, in banishment answer. Can the Orokin ever be forgiven?
What need has a devil for forgiveness? When hell is a lie spun by madmen.
Essentially, Roathe is telling both us and Entradi, what need does a regime have for forgiveness for its crimes when good and evil are essentially defined by whoever's in power? The Orokin needed to end, not be forgiven, something Roathe consistently presents as the only viable option for this and every other world's survival. Forgiveness isn't necessary because which of the Orokin 7 would even care or feel the desire to ask for such a thing? Put quite simply, they don't deserve any level of exoneration because they've never had the slightest desire to even ask for it. And if it would have been offered, wouldn't have wasted their time worrying about it because literally everyone they knew were beneath them, even the other 7 in their own minds in most cases. Can the Orokin ever be forgiven? No, pure and simple. And Roathe essentially mocks the very question with his answer. After all, given his involvement in so much of the Orokin's transgressions, he would know. Thankfully, of course, the Tenno finished the job that the Sentients may not have been able to complete, or that he didn't have the fortitude to complete himself. But what if they hadn't? Well, either the Sentients would have somehow evolved their way into thoroughly decimating the Orokin, or the Orokin would have essentially eradicated their Protean subjects and continued on with their misdirection, misinformation, a demonization of their enemy, framing a portrayal of their foe in an overwhelmingly negative and morally deficient manner. Careful propaganda and a willingness for the population to swallow it due to their basic need to survive. We are even offered a shockingly similar scenario playing out in Fortuna shortly before our arrival there, with their group only really being willing to fight back against Nefanyo and the Corpus after knowing the Tenno had reappeared to help them, allowing them to feel as though they could now actually fight back, with the operators most likely being recognized as the closest thing this place has to superheroes, but without question, saviors, given that's exactly what the 7 had presented them to the population as. Ironic, those same 7 failed to predict how these warriors would eventually liberate their own oppressed people. Saviors, just as they had been presented and honored as. But in the end, it's all just a matter of perspective. In hindsight, which group morally deserves to rule the galaxy? Is it the Sentients? Especially now that we know their intelligence and specifically their empathy can be almost immediately removed without the influence of a very particular flower? Who's really in charge in that almost certain circumstance? Are the Corpus any more fit to rule? Or more likely to make things worse, especially based on how things have transpired recently? The Grineer are what I would consider a simpler group in their desires, yet would their yearning for conflict really produce a stable society and way of life? Literally, every one of the current factions seated at each relay show their pettiness, their cruelty, when you're not properly aligned with their structure, their particular point of view on how things should be, invading and attempting to literally kill the Warframe that doesn't follow their doctrine. With all of this, the case could obviously be made that in reality, the only true good group within the Warframe universe, really the only ones looking out for others versus themselves, are our own Tenno. Yet, even they are still aiding and abetting each one of these lesser groups in some fashion, be it through syndicate work or helping either the Corpus or the Grineer during invasions. So even here, are we in fact pushing war in the Orokin system? Or is it the Lotus doing such a thing? Our military intelligence for the vast majority of the Tenno's journey. For a very, very brief moment, many of these groups came together during the New War, but those allegiances are now long gone, with everything essentially reverting back to how it was before the Sentients invaded. And it begs the question, depending on what we find in Tau in the present, when we eventually get there, what then? Is another war looming? With the aftermath of Narmer's defeat, The Sentients, whose own friends and families' lives were lost to, well, us, lingering there, perhaps even regathering their forces under Pazul for another attack. We actually learn the true reason Lotus wants us to venture back to Tau in our memories is to find another like Adis, one who can heal the Sentients. And I have a funny feeling she's looking for a way to shed her involvement in whatever capacity she has with the Indifference through this being. But if they believe in any capacity that Ballas was a kind of champion to them, will they too want, quote unquote, justice for what we did to him? Are we, the Tenno, really the good guys? Or are we no more than errand runners for first the Lotus, and now seemingly Albrecht and Trotty? And Trotty specifically has consistently demonstrated there's no limit to what he will do to bring his plan into fruition. And with the Lotus, well, we've been her own personal death squad since the very start. I actually think quite a few groups in the Origin system would very much classify us as enemies or perhaps even evil from their perspective. And can we really argue the point? Long, long after the Void War, the Second Sentient War, or even a new peace, what really is the eventual end for the Operator? Given that it appears aging isn't a thing for them, can they really live without a war? Perhaps, maybe the Drifter can detach, but can the Operators? And if not, I feel the logical end to all of this will of course be the Tenno Wars. We've seen from the Rel webcomic that even from the start, the children of the Zariman were not all altruistic, with a petty child specifically forcing Rel from the rest of the group. And what's worse, there's the influence they still seem to be capable of succumbing to. So how long until all of the Tenno no longer share a unified vision or are manipulated into such a thing, especially if something were to happen to the Lotus? To me, that in itself would be as convincing a catalyst as any, depending on the method by which it happens, wouldn't it? And then, we're really going to need to dig into the nuance of good and evil. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed today's video, and it, well, at first didn't make you too mad, but more importantly, that probably the best way to say it is, everyone's the hero of their own story. However, what I've always asked people is, when two heroes' objectives oppose, who's the good guy? Especially if the quote-unquote good each side is fighting for represents an equal number of people who stand to gain and lose, maybe even all on both sides. You know, the saddest truth I've come to understand over the many years I've lived is even the worst human being you've ever met believes unequivocally they are doing what they're supposed to, and are typically supported by quite a few with a similar mindset. It's really what allows them to be so certain in their actions. So, in order to change that, one has to change their mind, their way of thinking. But as we've seen, most, especially those with power, would rather just eliminate the other side and make sure to write the history books in such a way that they are the clear heroes. That's how it's always been, and will almost certainly remain the way it will always be. And with that in mind, I have to ask, will the Operators end as heroes or live long enough to become the villains? I leave that answer to all of you. As always, I'd like to thank the channel's members. I don't got the words to accurately describe to you how appreciative I am of your support. And I really do feel blessed to know you value my content enough to help out as you do. And for this, I am and will always be eternally grateful. Also, I can't forget my longtime channel support in G Fuel, a product I use to this day, not for this specific video, but given its longevity on the market, I believe that in itself speaks to its actual effectiveness and preference among many who, like myself, need a bit of a mental boost at times. So thank you to both again, and thank you to all who support this channel. You being willing to come back and watch what I put out, it's what makes everything worthwhile. So thank you again, and at any rate, I hope you all have a wonderful day, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.